Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar, The Open Access Advantage, How Open Access Improves Your Impact. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some valuable time with us here today. My name is Amy and I'm a member of the training team. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email with a link to the recording in 24 hours, along with a certificate of attendance. So do look out for that email. Also, the presentation that is being used today is linked in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel. We encourage you to download this and use it as a reference. Additionally, please note the questions section in the GoToWebinar panel. We encourage you to ask questions and they'll be addressed at the end of the session. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Alexander Hutchison is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cellular Physiology with Wiley. Alexander is a fitness and wellness expert in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Hutchison received his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Houston and completed an NIH-funded postdoctoral fellowship in HIV/AIDS immunology at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston, Texas. His two areas of study are the immune system's response to both acute exercise and chronic overtraining, and the genetic basis for the expression of skeletal muscle fiber types. He has authored two books, Exercise Ain't Enough, HIIT Honey and the Hadza, and The Swim Prescription. Prior to joining Wiley, Alexander was an associate professor and department chair of exercise science at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas. Also, we're lucky to have with us today Kaia Motter, Senior Manager, Open Research Americas with Wiley. Kaia is a senior manager with the Wiley team. In addition to keeping Wiley's open access and open research policies aligned with external open science policies and trends, she supports the expansion of Wiley's open research initiatives through collaboration with funders, policymakers, institutions, and open science innovators. I know we're really excited to learn from our speakers today, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hutch.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and we're so glad to have you with us. I'm going to show you the first slide of our presentation, which is going to give you some background of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go over some common misconceptions about publishing with open access. So the first one being that all open access journals engage in predatory practices. So we'll touch on that quickly after we get through this slide. The second one being that open access journals are often thought of being not cited as well as closed access journals, subscription-based journals. And then the third one being that the impact factor for open access journals tend to be lower than those for closed access journals. So let's start off with the idea about predatory journals. The vast majority of open access journals are legitimate, but there are some bad actors out there. And I've had personal experience with this when I was in academia. There was one time when I sent in a paper to a journal that had been told me was a good place to send exercise physiology work. And within an hour, I received an email and my paper had been accepted. No peer review required, and all they wanted was a publication fee. So I immediately yanked my paper out of that journal and found a different one. That stuff happens, unfortunately, more often than a lot of us know. But the other thing we see from predatory journals that marks them as being such is that they will tend to send a lot of spam messages out, and they sometimes use researchers' names without consent. So it's important that you look into the journal that you're going to send to, regardless of whether it's open or closed access, particularly open access, and make sure that they are legitimate. And there are ways to do that. Now, let's talk about citations, because this is the most important thing that we're all concerned with when we talk about publications, regardless of which route we decide to take. So to go into this background, I looked at several different publications on this particular idea of the differences between open access and closed access journals when it comes to citations and also altmetrics. This was the best paper that I found because it was the most robust in terms of it had a number of different articles that it was using in terms of data collection. And they also looked at 967 journals over a span from 2000 to 2019. Dr. Clayson from South Florida was also kind enough to give me his raw data so that I could do some additional calculations that I'll show you as we move forward. This particular study looked at papers that were published on the subjects of electrophysiology, specifically EEG, and what's called event-related brain potentials, which I looked up, but we don't need to get into that. So looking specifically at citations and altmetrics, let's start off with citations specifically on PubMed. And we can see that initially, at least, because the first open access journals, the very first one happened around 2001, but this wasn't a big thing until around 2010 when a lot of journals started to flip from closed to open access. And then from 2012 on, we can see that there's a clear distinction between open and closed access. And that in general, open access tends to outpace closed access when it comes to citations, total citations, that is. And then altmetrics, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail towards the end of the presentation, but this includes anything that is not a traditional citation. So this would be predominantly driven by social media, but then you also have newspapers, TV, radio, podcasts, anything that would be a non-traditional route that picks up additional information or additional attention for your particular work. And here as well, we can see that since 2012, open access papers that were in this particular study well outpaced those of closed access, which makes sense because when people have direct access to the papers and they don't have to go through a subscription route to get it, or if their particular library doesn't have access to that journal, they have to go through interlibrary loan, that slows down the ability to actually disseminate that information. So with an open access paper, you can grab it, you can post it to social media, or you can put it on your podcast, or you can put it out to a traditional media route like a news channel. So moving forward, now we're going to talk about citations per publication, because this is what really matters to everybody who's in academia. If you're interested in getting advancement in your career, the one thing you're going to have is, number one, a lot of publications, but you need them to be cited. And you need them to be able to be in journals that have high impact factors. And of course, the metric for impact factor basically is citations per publication. So this was data that I then collected myself from their raw data, and I put together the interpretation of the data for citations per publication. And on average, over the course of the 19 years that the data was collected, open access papers were cited 46% more often than closed access papers. Now, the one thing I want to point out here is as we go further up the timeline to more recent dates, you can see there's not much difference here between the two, and then it actually spaces out as we go back. The one thing that we'll notice over time is that citations take a while to actually accumulate. So that's why the impact factor is the 2 years in retrospect, and then you have a 5-year impact factor as well, because it takes a while for those papers to actually be disseminated out into the populace and then to be picked up and used in each individual person's, their own publications. So that's where altmetrics come in, and we'll talk about that soon as well. Now, in terms of impact factor, if we look at the individual impact factors of the journals that were cited in this particular paper, we see the same basic idea. The impact factor for the open access journals is actually about 19% higher on average over the 19 years of this study. So that's all great about work that's out in the populace, but what about Wiley specifically? Since we're the ones who are making this presentation and we're interested in you sending your papers to us, how do our journals and our papers do in terms of closed versus open access? So first, we'll talk a little bit about Wiley. We should put in a little shameless plug here about our corporation. It was founded in 1807, so it's been around for well over 200 years. And we've got about 175 years worth of publications within the sciences, technical, and engineering area. And we're now in our 7th generation today. We have over 1,200 scientific society partners, 1,600 peer-reviewed journals with over 8 million articles a year. And we've published, of course, over 450 Nobel Prize winners. So that's fantastic. We're a great corporation. And then here's some of the subcategories that we have. Over 126 subcategories to choose from. So this particular internal study collected data on over 200,000 papers over a 4-year span from January 2015 to August 2018. And they looked at downloads, citations, and then we also will look at alt metrics as well. So on average, when we look at over that 4-year span, open access papers were downloaded 3.1% more times more frequently than closed access, which again makes perfect sense. If the paper is readily available for anybody to grab, they're much more likely to download it than if they have to go through a subscription base. And the same thing is true for citations. If you have more access to a paper, you're more likely to use that paper in your own publication and cite that work than another one that you're going to have to wait for. Now let's go into alt metrics. This is going back to the paper by Clayson. If we look again here at the level of alt metrics that occurs for closed versus open access, you can see it's very clear that after about 2010, the number of alt metric citations that takes place for closed access paper, or sorry, open access papers well outpaces that for closed access. Now, why is there a break right here around 2010? Well, that's when we see the advent of a great deal more social media specific to scientific publications. Prior to that, you know, social media was used to just show pictures of what you did over the weekend, what meals you were eating. And much more recently, this is something that we see more often, particularly on places like Twitter, which is now X, and also LinkedIn. A lot of people will publish about their own individual works once they actually come out in print. In terms of our internal work, we see the same thing that Clayson saw in his global paper. In this case, within Wiley, we see that there's about 5.5 times more citations for alt metrics than we see for closed access. So who cares about alt metrics? Why is this important? Well, what we're interested in here is there a way to predict what's going to happen with your citations 2 to 5 years down the road if we use something now as a predictive score? And what we see in the publication data is that although not tremendously great correlations, they are statistically significant, and they do allow for some level of prediction of what's going to happen in the future with your citations, particularly when it comes to areas of medicine and biomedical research. So another thing to consider is that granting corporations and also universities in general, when it comes to hiring and promotion, have started to consider the impact that alt metrics has down the line. Alt metrics offer funders a greater intelligence regarding the use and reuse of this research, who's using it for what purposes. And then it also just allows for this work to be disseminated to a greater audience than just in academia. If it goes out into a traditional media source, like a newscast or a podcast, there's a whole host of additional people who are going to be exposed to your research and the quality of your work. So some take-home messages from this part of the presentation. Open access papers are cited significantly more frequently than closed access papers. Open access journals have higher impact factors than do subscription-based closed access journals. Open access papers get more alt metric attention than do closed access. And alt metrics are a reasonable and an immediate predictor of your future citation possibilities. So there's all sorts of good reasons to publish open access. And now I'm going to hand off the presentation to my partner, Kaia.
Thank you so much, Hutch. I'm hearing a bit of an echo away. It is so nice to see such broad geographic representation amongst our attendees today.
Hi, let me stop you for one moment because I want to take care of the echo. Hutch, is your system on mute?
Not yet.
Okay, that will probably help. Okay, give it a try.
Okay, great. All right, sounds good now. So yes, thank you all for being here. And it's just very encouraging to see such broad geographic representation amongst our attendees today. As you've heard earlier from Hutch, there are some tangible benefits to open access publication. In my part of the presentation, I'm going to take a deeper look at what is happening in the scholarly communications landscape, and also tell you a little bit about how Wiley is focusing on openness and transparency to help support the professional development of our authors. Next slide, please. So I wanted to set the stage for what I'm going to say next by highlighting the increasing number of open access policies from funders and institutions around the world. We recognize that many of you are now being asked by your institutions or your funder to make your research freely accessible to the public. This could mean publishing your article open access, but it could also mean making your data freely accessible. The list that I've provided here is just a handful of the new open access and open science policies that have emerged over the past several years. But we know that many of you are going to be impacted by these, and it will impact where you choose to publish your research. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we can support your open science objectives, and I'll talk about that in the coming slides. But I also wanted to share a little bit about some of the funder activities here, and note that many of the recent open access and open science directives we've seen have been from funders that were influenced by Coalition S, which originated with European funders, but has now become an increasingly international movement. And here in the US, which is where I'm based, about a year ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or the OSTP, issued a memo that directed US federal agencies to make the research they have funded, and that includes both articles and data, publicly accessible. And this is a new direction for federally funded research in the US. There are similar initiatives taking place in other pockets of the world. For example, in China, the OSPC is working towards developing a national open access policy. For those of you in Australia, you're aware that the country has just adopted an open access policy for NHMRC funded research. And I could go on. There are many more such national and institutional level open access policies underway. Next slide, please. I also wanted to speak a little bit about what we're doing to encourage responsible research assessment practices. Last year, we became a signatory of the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, otherwise known as DORA, which lays out a set of principles for publishers as well as for institutions and funders and others. Now, as you heard from Hutch, and I know that many of us are still very attached to the impact factor calculation, and so are funders and institutions. Many funders and institutions still use the impact factor and journal rankings to determine where research should be published. But we are increasingly trying to move away from an exclusive focus on the impact factor as the sole measure of quality. And we support the notion that there are several other metrics that can help provide a more holistic view of impact. The very first of DORA's principles is to reduce emphasis on the impact factor as a promotional tool. So we have adopted new marketing practices that highlight other metrics besides the impact factor. And in addition, we are now making those metrics publicly accessible to you, to our authors, as well as to the public. So you can find this information on the journal homepage through our journal finder tool, or for some journals, even on ResearchGate. And we know that you want to measure the impact of your individual work as well. You want to know how many times your article has been downloaded, for example, or how many citations it has received, or even how much it has been referenced in the media using the all-metric scores, as Hutch has just described. So this is now all publicly available on the individual article. So you can go and see for yourself after your article has published. Not all of our journals have adopted what's known as the credit taxonomy, but for those that do, each article will highlight the specific contributions of each author, not just the name and affiliation. Another important objective, which aligns with DORA principles, is increasing access to reference and abstract material. And this is another way that we are supporting you, our authors. And we have done this by signing up to 2 initiatives. One is called the Initiative for Open Citations, which is via Crossref Deposit, and the Initiative for Open Abstracts. So that corpus of metadata is available to be downloaded and available for further discovery, large-scale discovery, text mining, and so on. Another step we've taken is to make research metadata freely accessible on Wiley Online Library, which is where the journal is hosted. And that also increases opportunities for engagement and discovery. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, open research, or open science, as some people call it, is becoming a much bigger priority for funders and institutions around the world. Of course, in some subject disciplines, open research or open science has been common practice for many years, while for other disciplines, the practice has been less advanced and maybe not as common. We support here at Wiley, through our journals, many open science initiatives and practices that link out to the final published version of the article. Starting off, we have our under review program through Authoria, which is a preprint server. And this program allows the author to automatically post the preprint of their submitted article, which is then linked to their final published article on Wiley Online Library in the journal they chose. Data can also be shared through what's called a data availability statement, which can then also link out to the raw data hosted on an external repository. The preprint server Authoria also allows for interactive data sets to be published. Registered reports, which are not common for all subject disciplines, are available in all journals, but it is a practice that can help mitigate a variety of questionable research practices. For example, low statistical power, selective reporting of results, and publication bias. So engaging in the publication of a registered report can really help to safeguard the author against unwanted research integrity inquiries. Persistent identifiers like the ORCID or ORCID are an important way to preserve a unique and lasting reference to the author's work and to their affiliations. And we, of course, encourage the use of ORCIDs, and we also support the acknowledgement of individual author contributions through the credit taxonomy. Transparent peer review is another opportunity that enables accountability in the peer review process. And it also encourages the recognition of work that is done by peer reviewers as well as editors. Our reviewer recognition program, which is run through Web of Science, formerly known as Publons, is another way that we highlight the valuable contributions of our reviewers with formal credit for their contribution. So ultimately at Wiley, we recognize the benefits of sharing and publishing research artifacts from every stage of the research lifecycle. And we do this in order to encourage greater engagement with the author's research, but also to support transparency and access to results that will build trust in research integrity and ultimately trust in science. Next slide. So I wanted to show you what these metrics actually look like on the preprint and the journal homepage. Here we have two examples of how article level metrics are displayed on a preprint. The example on the left is a preprint, and the example on the right is a journal article. You can see on the metric page that you are able to see the number of times the preprint has been viewed, but you can also track usage and so you can track usage and downloads, but you can also track peer review progress as especially if you participate in the under review program that is linked to one of Wiley's journals. On the right, you see an example here from Ecology and Evolution, and you can see how the individual article metrics are displayed. So if you are ever curious about how your research, what kind of impact your research is having, you can go to visit the article on Wiley Online Library. You can see how many times it's been viewed, how many times it's been cited, if it's been referenced in the media, and if the journal participates in cite, you can also take a look at how the article is being supported, mentioned, or contrasted in other publications. Next slide, please. We have recently taken steps, as I mentioned before, when we became a DORA signatory. And we've taken steps now to make sure that we are displaying a comprehensive set of metrics that measure not only citation impacts and not just the impact factor, but also usage and peer review performance. So by the end of this year, 2023, the majority of our journals will display the cite score, which is from Scopus, which is a citation metric. They will display the journal citation indicator, which is from Clarivate. They will display the journal impact factor, of course, from Clarivate. But they will also now show full text views, and this is for the journal as a whole, not just the article. It will show the journal's acceptance rate, turnaround times from submission to first decision, and turnaround time from submission to acceptance, which are calculated as a median. And so you can go to the journal homepage of your journal of choice and review all of these metrics. And this will, of course, help you to make a decision about where to publish your research. Next slide, please. Another resource we are developing is what we call the Journal Finder tool. And this is essentially a journal search tool that will allow you to search for the best journal for your particular subject area or area of focus. So you can search by subject area or topic. And you can also find out other details about the journal that might be relevant to your particular needs. For example, if the journal has an open access publication option, for example, if you're mandated to publish open access by your funder, and you can line up your selections side by side to compare and to find out which is the best publication for your research. Perhaps most importantly, this tool also gives you a quick snapshot of all the metrics that are available for that particular journal. So this of course includes citation impact, usage, peer review performance. And ultimately, hopefully, this tool will be helpful in terms of saving you time so that you can find the right match for your research. You're not wasting time submitting to a journal that's out of scope for the work you've done. But it also will help you to really make sure that you are finding a journal that can accommodate whatever policies you may have to comply with from your funder or for your institution. Next slide, please. So before I end, I wanted to make you aware of our approach to sound science publication. And we have approximately 35 journals, but probably more, that are officially designated as sound science publications. And this means that these journals will consider the full range of research artifacts that might be appropriate for publication, including things like methods, data descriptors, case reports. But these journals will also consider research that is often rejected by more selective journals. And so that could include null hypotheses or negative results. It could include replication studies, and it could also include preliminary results. And these are all really important and essential document types that will help other researchers save them time and ultimately reduce or duplicated effort. So that's one thing, one reason why we very much value sound science publications. But the other thing to keep in mind is that these journals, they will only publish articles that are within scope, meaning within the journal's defined subject category. And it is also essential to know that these articles, any article submitted to any Wiley journal for that matter, must demonstrate compliance with research integrity and ethics standards, and that the data and methodology must be sound. I think it probably goes without saying, but all Wiley journals are peer-reviewed, and so all articles must go through peer review before they are accepted or rejected. So to sum up, it is really our goal to support authors at every stage in their career and to make sure that there are publication opportunities, especially for early career researchers, but also for senior investigators who may have preliminary findings that they want to share and get out there quickly. Sound science publications expand publication opportunities for authors, and many of these journals also support open access publication, which will ultimately increase the impact of the author's work, as you've heard from Hutch earlier in this presentation. So that concludes my part of the presentation, and now I think we are ready to move on to question and answers.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation, Kaia and Hutch. Thank you for your time. Let me see if you want to take a look in the question box. If we have any questions, please do type anything you want to ask into the question box and we will get that addressed. I don't think I'm seeing any at the moment. Give it a moment here. In the meantime, I want to remind you that you will receive a link to the recording of the session in 24 hours, and you will also receive a certificate of attendance in your email. So do keep an eye out for that email. Okay, give it a moment. I don't see any questions. Let me see. Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for being with us today. Also, download the slides in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel. And I want to thank our speakers for their time and expertise and sharing their knowledge with us today. Thank you so much, Kaia and Hutch, for joining us today. I really appreciate that. Let's just double check if there's a question. I do see one now. if you want to, for CA, does the author receive any money?
Could you perhaps clarify the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, let's see if they can add to that.
Give
Give that a moment. Okay, while we wait for that, I will read. Under Journal Finder tool, under the publisher Wiley be found, is the tool released yet?
That's a good question. The Journal Finder tool will be released within the next several months, so it's not accessible yet, but it will be soon.
Okay. Let's see. Let's try to get this.
And I should also mention that the metrics, I think I did mention this, but the metrics that are displayed on the journal homepage, some journals have metrics already, but the majority of our journals will have those metrics by the end of this year.
Excellent. Okay. Is the number of full text views reliable? Will it exclude self views?
That's a good question. The usage data is collected internally, so I believe that we have mechanisms for filtering out, for example, usage from bots, but I'm not sure about self views. I can follow up on that.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, we didn't get any further information on the other question. There's a question about an article needing a subscription fee. Do the authors get any benefit? Does that make
I think that it almost sounds like a kickback. The author is not going to receive any additional benefit for going open versus closed access in terms of the paper. No.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and there's a couple others we can get to offline. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And thanks again to the speakers. I hope everyone has a great day, great evening, wherever you are. And we'll see you for the next webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.